They noticed a burn on his uniform and immediately assumed he was just some old, forgotten figure and outdated relic clinging to ceremony. They laughed, mocked him, said he looked like he'd ironed his tunic with a landmine, but he didn't react. No words, no movement, just silent, unmoved stillness. Then, a brigadier stepped onto the square, paused mid-stride and noticed the faded tag beneath the old soldier's cuff. He read it aloud, just 3 words, and in that instant every cadet froze. That wasn't just a stain. It was the residue of a mission so classified, no one speaks of it. Most of the men involved never returned. And the man they tried to humiliate, he never had to defend himself, because when that brigadier spoke, every mocking voice vanished. Before we reveal what happened next, let us know where in the world you're watching from, and tell us, do you believe true respect is earned quietly, not demanded loudly? Now let's begin. Fort Braxton had seen its share of ceremonies, rows of pristine uniforms, polished boots that could blind a man, and the kind of military precision that made civilians stop and stare. But on this particular morning, something was different, something that would change how everyone in that courtyard viewed heroism forever. Sergeant Major Reuben Maddox stood at attention among the ranks. At 47, his face told stories that younger soldiers couldn't yet comprehend. Deep lines, carved by desert sun and mountain cold. Eyes that had seen too much but never looked away. His uniform was immaculate, pressed to perfection, every button gleaming, every crease sharp enough to cut paper. Except for one thing. A dark stain spread across his left sleeve like spilled ink on white paper. Irregular in shape, stubborn in its refusal to fade, it seemed to mock the perfection around it. And in a world where appearances meant everything, that stain might as well have been a scarlet letter. The whispers started like ripples in a pond. First one cadet, then another, their eyes drawn to that imperfection like moths to flame. 20-year-old faces that had never seen real combat, never felt the weight of a dying man in their arms, began to curl into smirks. "Look at that," whispered Cadet Morrison, barely containing his laughter. "Guess someone can't handle his morning coffee." His buddy, Cadet Williams, snorted. "Maybe he's colorblind. Can't tell the difference between his uniform and his breakfast plate." The laughter was quiet at first, respectful of the ceremony about to begin. But, like all cruel things, it grew bolder with each passing moment. Soon, half the formation was stealing glances at Maddox's sleeve, some shaking their heads in disgust, others barely suppressing their amusement. Captain Barkley noticed the commotion. Fresh from his promotion, barely 30 years old, he saw an opportunity to assert his authority, to show these cadets what real military bearing looked like. He stepped forward, his chest puffed out like a peacock's, his voice carrying across the courtyard with the confidence of someone who'd never been truly tested. "Sergeant Major," Barkley called out, his tone dripping with false concern. "Perhaps you'd like to explain your unique interpretation of military dress code." The courtyard fell silent. 200 pairs of eyes turned toward Maddox, waiting for his response. But the weathered sergeant said nothing, didn't even flinch. His gaze remained fixed on the horizon, as if he could see something the rest of them couldn't. That silence seemed to embolden Barkley further. He began to circle Maddox like a predator, sensing weakness, his voice growing louder, more theatrical. "At ease, Sergeant, though judging by that uniform, at ease might be your default setting." The laughter that erupted was no longer contained. It rolled across the formation like thunder, feeding on itself, growing stronger with each echo. Some of the younger officers joined in, their own insecurities masked by the safety of the crowd. But Maddox still said nothing. His fingers just, for a moment, brushed against the stain. Not in shame, but in something else entirely. Something that looked almost like reverence. What those laughing soldiers didn't know, what they couldn't possibly understand, was that Reuben Maddox had been having the same dream for 3 years. Every night, without fail, he found himself back in that god-forsaken valley in Afghanistan, surrounded by the sound of gunfire and the smell of blood. The dream always started the same way. The convoy had been ambushed at dawn, caught in a narrow pass with nowhere to run. 12 men from the 22nd Special Operations Unit, the best of the best, suddenly found themselves pinned down by enemy fire from 3 sides. The radio crackled with desperate calls for air support that everyone knew wouldn't come in time. In the dream, Maddox could see Private Daniel Haskins clearly, 22 years old, barely old enough to buy a beer back home, but tough as nails when it mattered. Haskins had been the unit's medic, the one who patched them up when the fighting got rough. He had gentle hands and a quick smile, the kind of kid who wrote letters to his mother every single day. The grenade had landed between them without warning. In the split second before it detonated, Maddox had made a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He'd thrown himself toward Haskins, not away from the explosion. The blast had torn through them both, but Haskins had taken the worst of it. That's when the blood started, not just from the shrapnel wounds but from something deeper, something that couldn't be stitched up or bandaged. As Maddox pulled Haskins to safety, the young medic's life was flowing out of him like water from a broken dam, soaking into everything it touched. Sarge Haskins had whispered, his voice barely audible over the gunfire. "Sarge, I can't feel my legs." Maddox had looked into those young eyes and seen something that would stay with him forever. Not fear, not pain, but trust. Complete, absolute trust that his sergeant would get him home. "You're gonna be fine, son," Maddox had lied, lifting Haskins onto his back. "Just hold on tight." What followed was the longest mile of Maddox's life. Through enemy fire, across rocky terrain, with a dying man clinging to his shoulders. Every step felt like a lifetime. Every breath was a prayer. And all the while, Haskins' blood seeped deeper into his uniform, marking him in ways that soap and water could never wash away. By the time they reached the evacuation point, Haskins was gone. His last words, whispered into Maddox's ear as life left his body, were about his mother, about how she'd be proud of him, about how he hoped to see her again someday. The other soldiers in the courtyard saw a stain. Maddox saw a young man's last breath, crystallized in fabric and time. The laughter in the courtyard was reaching its peak when the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Conversations died mid-sentence. Smiles froze on faces. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Brigadier Charles Lennox had arrived at 61. Lennox was a walking piece of military history. His chest bore ribbons that told the story of America's conflicts over the past 4 decades. Vietnam, Grenada, Panama, Iraq, Afghanistan, if there'd been a fight. Lennox had been there. His gray eyes had seen empires rise and fall, had watched good men die for causes both noble and questionable. But it wasn't his decorations that commanded respect. It was something deeper, something that radiated from him like heat from a forge, the kind of presence that made career soldiers straighten their spines and young officers question their life choices. Lennox didn't hurry. He never hurried. Each step was measured, deliberate, like a man who had learned that rushing usually led to mistakes, and mistakes in his world got people killed. As he approached the formation, his eyes swept across the assembled troops with the precision of a radar sweep. When his gaze fell on Captain Barkley, the younger officer's face went pale. The laughter that had seemed so clever moments before now felt like a lead weight in his stomach. Barkley had heard the stories about Lennox everyone had. The man was a legend, but not the kind you wanted to cross. "Captain," Lennox said, his voice carrying the authority of decades in uniform. "Explain the commotion." Berkeley's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. The confidence that had driven him to mock Maddox evaporated like morning dew. He gestured weakly toward the sergeant's sleeve, his voice barely above a whisper. Just ensuring standards are maintained, sir. Sergeant Maddox appears to have an issue with his uniform." Lennox's expression didn't change. He simply nodded, as if Berkeley's words confirmed something he'd already suspected. Then, without warning, he stepped forward and gripped Maddox's sleeve between his fingers. The fabric was stiff, not with starch or sizing, but with something that had dried and hardened over time, something that had become part of the material itself. Lennox examined it with the focus of a forensic scientist, his weathered fingers tracing the edges of the stain. "You think this is a stain?" he asked, his voice so quiet that the front rank had to strain to hear. No one answered. The question hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield, thick and suffocating. Lennox straightened, his gray eyes sweeping across the assembled troops. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "Form a circle around me. All of you now." The order was given quietly, but it might as well have been shouted through a megaphone. Soldiers scrambled to comply, cadets pushing forward, officers repositioning themselves. Within moments, Lennox stood at the center of a human amphitheater, with Maddox beside him like a defendant awaiting judgment. "You want to know about stains?" Lennox asked, his voice carrying to every corner of the circle. "Let me tell you about stains." Lennox reached for Maddox's unit tag, pulling it from his collar with the reverence of a man handling a sacred relic. The small piece of metal caught the morning sun, reflecting light like a mirror. But it was the words etched into its surface that would change everything. 22nd Special Operations, Lennox read aloud, his voice carrying across the silent courtyard. Battle of Almera, Operation Sandstorm. The effect was immediate. Several of the older officers straightened, recognition dawning in their eyes. Almera was a name that carried weight in military circles, the kind of operation that was whispered about in officer clubs and remembered in Pentagon briefings. 12 men went in, Lennox continued, his voice steady as granite. 3 came out. Sergeant Maddox carried 2 of them on his back through a mile of enemy fire. The circle tightened as soldiers leaned forward, straining to hear every word. The casual mockery of moments before had evaporated, replaced by something deeper, something that felt like the moment before a thunderstorm. "Breaks. This stain you find so amusing," Lennox said, gripping Maddox's sleeve and holding it up for all to see, "is the last breath of Private Daniel Haskins, 22 years old, a medic who died saving his brothers, who died thanking the man who carried him to safety." The silence that followed was deafening. It was the kind of quiet that comes after an explosion, when the world holds its breath and waits for the ringing in its ears to stop. Several cadets looked away, their faces flushed with shame. Others stared at the ground, suddenly finding their polished boots fascinating. Captain Barkley looked like he was about to be sick. The color had drained from his face so completely that he resembled a ghost. His hands trembled slightly at his sides, and when he tried to speak, no words came out. But it was Sergeant Maddox who broke the silence. For the first time since the ceremony began, he spoke. His voice was rough, weathered by years of shouting orders over gunfire and desert winds. "Haskins' mother asked me to wear it," he said simply, "so he could see her at graduation." The words hit the assembled soldiers like physical blows. Several cadets' hands flew to their mouths. Others looked away, their eyes suddenly bright with unshed tears. The transformation was complete. What had been a source of mockery was now revealed as something sacred, something that deserved reverence, not ridicule. Private Haskins was going to be married, Maddox continued, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. 2 weeks after his deployment ended. Sarah was her name. She still sends me Christmas cards. A young cadet in the front row began to cry, not the quiet, dignified tears of a funeral, but the raw, ugly sobs of someone confronting their own cruelty. The sound seemed to break something in the rest of the formation, and soon the air was filled with sniffles and quiet apologies. He carried pictures of his nephew, Maddox went on, his eyes fixed on something beyond the circle of soldiers. Kid was learning to walk. Haskins used to say he was going to teach him to play catch when he got home. The weight of those words settled over the courtyard like a blanket. These weren't just statistics or casualty reports. This was a life, a future that had been cut short, a family that would never be whole again. Lennox stepped forward, his voice taking on the tone of a man who had lived through the events he was describing. The Battle of Armera wasn't just military history to him, it was personal. "Let me tell you what really happened in that valley," he said, his gray eyes scanning the faces around him, "because you need to understand what kind of man stands before you." The ambush had been perfectly planned. The Taliban had studied American convoy routes for months, waiting for the perfect opportunity. The 22nd Special Operations Unit was returning from a successful raid, their guard down just enough to be vulnerable. When the attack came, it was swift and merciless. 12 of America's finest soldiers, Lennox continued, caught in a kill zone with nowhere to run. The enemy had the high ground, superior numbers, and every advantage except one: they were fighting Americans. The first hour of the battle was chaos. Grenades rained down from the ridgeline while automatic weapons fire poured in from 3 directions. The unit's radio operator was killed in the first few minutes, cutting them off from air support. Their ammunition was running low, and the enemy seemed to have an endless supply of fighters. That's when Maddox made his first decision. As the senior non-commissioned officer, he could have ordered his men to hold position and wait for rescue. Instead, he chose to act. Sergeant Maddox organized a fighting withdrawal, Lennox explained, moving his men in teams, using covering fire to keep the enemy at bay. It was textbook infantry tactics, executed under the worst possible conditions. But textbook tactics could only do so much when facing overwhelming odds. One by one, the soldiers began to fall. Corporal Martinez took a sniper's bullet to the chest. Staff Sergeant Williams was killed by a mortar round. Private Johnson bled out from shrapnel wounds while trying to reach better cover. By the time they reached the valley floor, Lennox continued, they were down to 6 men. 6 soldiers facing at least 40 enemy fighters, with no air support and limited ammunition. That's when the second grenade landed, the one that changed everything. Maddox had seen it coming, a dark object arcing through the air, trailing smoke like a falling star. He'd had perhaps 2 seconds to react, enough time to throw himself clear, to save his own life and let fate decide the rest. Instead, he'd thrown himself toward Private Haskins. The blast should have killed them both, Lennox said, his voice growing quiet. The medical report said it was a miracle that either of them survived the initial explosion, but Haskins was in bad shape, really bad. The description that followed, that was clinical but devastating. Massive blood loss, internal injuries, probable spinal damage. Even with immediate medical attention, Haskins' chances would have been slim. In the middle of a firefight, with no medical supplies and no way to call for help, they were essentially zero. Any rational person would have made Haskins comfortable and focused on saving the men who still had a chance, Lennox said. Maddox refused to accept that logic. What followed was a journey that would be studied in military academies for decades to come, not because of its strategic brilliance, but because of its sheer, stubborn refusal to accept defeat. Maddox had looked at his dying medic and made a promise, not just to Haskins, but to his mother, to his fiancée, to everyone who loved him. He was going to get the kid home no matter what it costs. "Picture this," Lennox said, his voice painting the scene with painful clarity. A 40 sergeant carrying a dying man through enemy territory. No backup, no air support, just one man's determination to keep a promise. The first challenge was the terrain. The valley floor was a maze of rocks and ravines, perfect for ambushes but hell for someone carrying a wounded man. Every step had to be calculated, every movement planned to avoid enemy sightlines. The second challenge was Haskins himself. The young medic was slipping in and out of consciousness, his weight shifting unpredictably. Blood loss was making him delirious, and more than once he tried to convince Maddox to leave him behind. "I can't make it," Sarge Haskins had whispered during one of their brief stops. Just go without me." Maddox's response had been typical of the man, short, direct, and absolute. Not happening, son. We're going home together. The third challenge was the enemy. Taliban fighters were combing the valley, searching for survivors. They knew the Americans were wounded and desperate, and they were taking their time, savoring the hunt. Maddox covered that mile in 4 hours, Lennox continued. 4 hours of carrying a dying man while enemy fighters closed in from all sides. He had to stop every few hundred yards to rest, to check on Haskins, to figure out his next move. The mental picture was staggering. A lone soldier, deep in enemy territory, refusing to abandon his wounded brother. Every step was a victory against overwhelming odds. Every breath was a declaration of war against fate itself. Twice they were almost caught, Lennox said, once by a patrol that passed within 10 feet of their hiding spot. Another time by a sniper who had them in his crosshairs but couldn't get a clean shot. But perhaps the most heartbreaking part of the journey was Haskins himself. As his life ebbed away, the young medic began to talk about his mother, about his fiancée, about the life he'd never get to live. And all the while, his blood soaked deeper into Maddox's uniform, marking him in ways that would never wash away. He talked about his nephew, Maddox said quietly, his voice barely audible. Kid was just learning to walk. Haskins had this video on his phone, must have watched it 100 times. He said he was going to teach him to play catch when he got home. The circle of soldiers had grown completely silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as Maddox continued. He asked me to tell his mother he wasn't scared. Asked me to tell his fiancée he loved her. Asked me to make sure his nephew knew his uncle was a good man. The evacuation point was a small clearing about a mile from the ambush site. It wasn't much, just a flat patch of ground large enough for a helicopter to land. But to Maddox it might as well have been the gates of heaven. By the time they reached the LZ, Lennox continued, Haskins was barely conscious. The blood loss was severe, and shock was setting in. But he was still alive, still breathing. The helicopter was late. What should have been a quick extraction turned into an agonizing wait as enemy fighters continued to close in. Maddox had positioned himself and Haskins behind a small rock outcropping, the only cover available in the open clearing. They waited. 43 minutes, Lennox said. 43 minutes of listening to gunfire getting closer, of watching Haskins fade in and out of consciousness. 43 minutes of praying to whatever God might be listening. When the helicopter finally appeared, it came under immediate fire. The pilot had to make 3 passes before he could land, and even then he couldn't stay on the ground long. The evacuation had to be fast, a matter of seconds, not minutes. Maddox carried Haskins to that helicopter, Lennox said, his voice thick with emotion. Carried him like he was made of spun glass, like he was the most precious thing in the world. The medical crew was waiting, professional, official. They took Haskins from Maddox's arms and immediately began working on him. 4 lines, chest compressions, desperate attempts to buy time. But even as they worked, everyone in that helicopter knew the truth. They were too late. Haskins died 2 minutes after takeoff, Lennox said quietly. 2 minutes. After everything Maddox had done, after that impossible journey, they were 2 minutes too late. The words hung in the air like a physical weight. Several soldiers in the circle were openly crying now, their faces streaked with tears. The casual cruelty of their earlier mockery seemed like something from another lifetime. But he wasn't alone, Maddox said, his voice steady, despite the emotion behind it. He wasn't alone when he died. That matters. The young medic's final words were about his mother, about how proud she would be, about how he'd tried to be brave. And all the while, his blood continued to seep into Maddox's uniform, creating a stain that would never fade. I made him a promise, Maddox continued. Told him I'd carry him home. I kept that promise. This stain, it's not dirt. It's not carelessness. It's proof that I kept my word. The transformation in the courtyard was complete. What had begun as mockery had become something sacred. The soldiers who had laughed at Maddox's stained uniform now looked at him with something approaching reverence. Private Haskins was posthumously awarded the Silver Star, Lennox announced, for his actions under fire, for his dedication to his brothers in arms. The medal is in his mother's living room, next to his high school diploma and his acceptance letter to medical school. The weight of those words settled over the assembly like a blanket. This wasn't just a story about one soldier's sacrifice. It was about the cost of freedom, about the price paid by families who would never be whole again. Captain Barkley stood frozen in the center of the circle, his face a mask of shame and regret. The confidence that had driven him to mock Maddox had evaporated completely, replaced by the crushing weight of his own cruelty. Captain Lennox, said his voice carrying the authority of decades in uniform, do you have something to say? Berkeley's mouth opened and closed several times before any words came out. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I didn't know, sir. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. You're sorry. Lennox's voice was deceptively quiet. You made a mockery of a fallen soldier's sacrifice because you didn't know the facts. Is that your excuse? The question hung in the air like a blade. Berkeley's face crumpled as the full weight of his actions hit him. He had humiliated a war hero in front of 200 soldiers. He had turned a sacred memorial into a source of entertainment. "No excuse, sir," Barclay said, his voice breaking. "No excuse at all." Lennox stepped closer, his gray eyes boring into the younger officer's soul. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of every battlefield, every fallen soldier, every family that had paid the ultimate price. "You see a stain on a uniform and you think you know what it means," he said. "You see something that doesn't meet your standards and you assume the worst, but you never asked. You never wondered. You never considered that there might be a story behind what you were seeing." The circle of soldiers pressed closer, drawn by the magnetic pull of the confrontation. This wasn't just about one captain's mistake. It was about judgment, about assumptions, about the danger of making decisions without understanding the consequences. "In my 42 years of service," Lennox continued, "I've learned that the most important battles are often the ones you can't see. The struggles that happen in the heart, in the mind, in the soul. Sergeant Maddox has been fighting one of those battles for 3 years, and you just made it harder." Berkeley's legs seemed to give out. He sank to one knee. His head bowed, tears flowing freely down his face. The proud officer who had strutted across the courtyard minutes before was gone, replaced by a broken man confronting his own cruelty. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "God, I'm so sorry." But it was Maddox who stepped forward, his weathered hand reaching down to help Barclay to his feet. The gesture was so unexpected, so gracious, that several soldiers gasped audibly. "Don't apologize to me," Maddox said quietly. "Apologize to him." He touched the stain on his sleeve, and suddenly everyone understood. The apology wasn't for Maddox. It was for Private Daniel Haskins, whose sacrifice had been mocked and diminished. It was for his mother, who had asked that the stain be preserved. It was for every fallen soldier who had ever been forgotten or dismissed. "I'm sorry, Private Haskins," Barclay said, his voice carrying across the silent courtyard. "I'm sorry for dishonoring your sacrifice. I'm sorry for making light of your death. I'm sorry for failing to understand what true service means." The words seemed to lift a weight from the assembly. Soldiers who had been holding their breath suddenly exhaled. The oppressive silence that had gripped the courtyard began to ease, replaced by something deeper and more meaningful. Lennox straightened, his commanding presence once again taking control of the situation. But when he spoke, his voice had changed. The anger was gone, replaced by something that sounded almost like a teacher addressing his students. "Let me tell you what I see when I look at this uniform," he said, gesturing to Maddox's stained sleeve. "I see a man who kept his word when it would have been easier to break it. I see a soldier who carried his brother through hell because that's what brothers do. I see a monument to courage that puts every medal I've ever seen to shame." The lesson was clear, but Lennox wasn't finished. He had spent 4 decades in the military, had seen countless young soldiers make the same mistakes, had watched pride and ignorance destroy careers and lives. This was his chance to prevent it from happening again. "In this business," he continued, "we talk a lot about honor, about duty, about sacrifice, but those are just words until they're tested. Until you're faced with a choice between what's easy and what's right. Sergeant Maddox was tested in that valley, and he passed. The question is, what will you do when your moment comes?" The cadets in the circle shifted uncomfortably. These weren't abstract concepts anymore. They were real challenges that might someday define their own lives. Would they have the courage to carry a dying friend through enemy fire? Would they keep their promises when the cost became unbearable? "I want each of you to remember this moment," Lennox said. "Remember how it felt to judge something you didn't understand. Remember how quickly your assumptions crumbled when faced with the truth. Remember that every person you meet is fighting battles you can't see." Maddox stood quietly beside him, his weathered face showing no emotion. He had told his story not for sympathy or recognition, but because it needed to be told. Because Private Haskins deserved to be remembered. Because the young soldiers in that circle needed to understand what service really meant. "There's one more thing," Maddox said suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence. "Haskins left something for his nephew, a letter. I've been carrying it for 3 years, waiting for the right time to deliver it." He reached into his breast pocket and withdrew a small envelope, carefully preserved and yellowed with age. The paper was soft from handling, folded and refolded countless times. "He wrote it the night before the ambush," Maddox continued. He knew something was going to happen. It's advice about being a good man, about standing up for what's right, about never giving up on your dreams." The sight of that letter hit the assembled soldiers like a physical blow. This wasn't just about one man's death, it was about the future he would never see, the wisdom he would never share, the love he would never express. "The boy is 7 now," Maddox said quietly, "old enough to understand. His aunt says he asks about his uncle sometimes, wants to know if he was brave." The question hung in the air, and everyone knew the answer. Private Daniel Haskins had been brave, braver than most people could ever imagine, and his sacrifice had been honored by a man who refused to let him be forgotten. The ceremony continued, but everything had changed. The casual confidence of the morning had been replaced by something deeper, more meaningful. Soldiers who had been going through the motions now stood with genuine respect. The ritual of military Formation had become something sacred. When the official proceedings ended, the courtyard didn't empty as usual. Instead, soldiers lingered, drawn by an invisible force to the small memorial wall that stood at the edge of the parade ground. It was a simple structure, black granite with names etched in gold, but it represented something profound. Maddox walked to the wall slowly, his fingers tracing the familiar letters. Daniel Haskins, Medichero, brother. He had performed this ritual countless times over the past 3 years, but today felt different. Today, others were watching. Today, they understood. "We put up this wall 5 years ago," Lennox said, addressing the crowd that had gathered. "It was supposed to be a memorial to our fallen. But I think we missed the point. It's not about the dead, it's about the living. It's about making sure their sacrifice means something." One by one, soldiers began to approach the wall. Some left flowers, others left unit patches or challenge coins. A few simply stood in silence, their heads bowed in respect. The transformation was complete. What had begun as mockery had become reverence. Captain Berkeley was among the last to approach. His face was still streaked with tears, his uniform rumpled from his earlier collapse, but he carried himself with a dignity that hadn't been there before. The kind of bearing that comes from confronting one's own failures and choosing to be better. He reached into his pocket and withdrew his captain's bars as symbols of rank that had driven him to mock Maddox in the first place. Without hesitation, he placed them at the base of the wall, beneath Haskins' name. "I don't deserve these," he said quietly. "Not yet. Maybe someday, if I can learn to be the kind of officer who honors the fallen instead of mocking them." The gesture was unexpected, but it felt right. Rank meant nothing without character. Authority was worthless without wisdom. Leadership required understanding, not just power. As the sun began to set, the courtyard slowly emptied. Soldiers returned to their duties, but they carried something new with them, a deeper understanding of what service meant, a greater appreciation for the sacrifices made by their brothers and sisters in arms. Maddox remained at the wall, his weathered hand resting on the stone. The stain on his sleeve caught the last rays of sunlight, no longer a source of shame but a badge of honor. Reminder that some things are worth carrying no matter how heavy they become. "You did good today, son," he whispered to the wall. "Your nephew's going to be proud of his uncle." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and the promise of tomorrow. Somewhere in the distance, a bugle began to play taps, a haunting melody that had closed military days for generations. But for once it didn't sound like an ending, it sounded like a beginning. The next morning, when the soldiers assembled for formation, everything was different. Uniforms were still pressed, boots were still polished, but the atmosphere had changed. There was a new respect in the air, a deeper understanding of what it meant to serve. And when they saw Sergeant Major Maddox standing at attention, his stained sleeve visible in the morning light, nobody laughed. They saluted. This story reminds us that heroism isn't always visible. Sometimes it's carried in the heart, worn on the sleeve, and honored in the silence between heartbeats. Private Daniel Haskins may have died in a valley in Afghanistan, but his memory lives on in every soldier who chooses duty over comfort, sacrifice over safety, and brotherhood over self-preservation. The stain on Sergeant Maddox's uniform wasn't a mark of shame, it was a badge of honor, a reminder that some promises are worth keeping no matter the cost. And sometimes, the greatest battles are fought not with weapons, but with the simple decision to never leave a brother behind.